Hi, Simon. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's very good to be with you too.
So CUTS International is organizing its flagship event, the 7th Biennial Conference, on 16th and 17th of November 2021. And you are one of our esteemed speakers at the conference and somebody who has had a long-term association with CUTS International. I would like to know your views about this year's theme for the biennial, which is building blocks for an inclusive and resilient economy.
Well, let me begin by saying thank you very much for the invitation to speak at the conference. It's true that I have known CUTS for many years. I think in the early years, we did a lot of work on international competition law and policy, and then I've gone off and done more things on trade and protectionism since. But our paths have crossed again, and that's very welcome. Now, to the substance of the conference, I think the theme is very well chosen. I mean, there is a lot of interest these days in both inclusivity and resilience of economies. I think that's very important. I mean, people may have different notions of what constitutes inclusivity. Maybe some on the left think in terms of outcomes, in capitalist outcomes, and some on the right might think about the opportunities which generate an inclusive society. And I think it's very important to talk through how one can build an inclusive society, perhaps along one or both of those dimensions. In light of the pandemic, resilience is, of course, a natural subject for people to talk about. We found our supply chains and our private sectors stretched in ways that we have never anticipated. Not every outcome has been what people have wanted and desired, and naturally, people want to think again. I think here the thing I would caution against is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Just because supply chains designed for a non-COVID world didn't work doesn't mean supply chains can never work. So I think we have to have a subtle conversation about how corporate form has to evolve in order to provide more assurance and security that supplies are delivered when they're absolutely needed.
Thank you, Simon. That was fascinating. I understand how things have changed in terms of COVID, and countries usually have to build a lot of strategies. They basically have to develop a lot of strategies to overcome what they've suffered in COVID. Moving on to the second question that I have is, in times of COVID, countries have severely suffered in trade, and protectionism is on rise. So how do you suggest that countries can build in a sense that they move towards multilateralism? More so, civil societies can help in moving towards the agenda and the goal.
So let's start with your starting point, which is that in response to the pandemic, a lot of governments put in place policies which ultimately distorted trade, not necessarily restricted trade, but distorted it. You might argue that that's okay so long as those policies are temporary and that they are withdrawn. The history, unfortunately, is that when we have these crises, the withdrawing of so-called temporary measures doesn't happen. I think it was Milton Friedman who once said, there's nothing more permanent than a temporary government policy. And so we do have to worry about the capacity of the world trading system to recover and go back to the pre-pandemic trade policy stances that we saw. Now that concern is on top of a long-standing worry that governments have lost the knack of cooperating on trade policy, especially in the multilateral fora. And I think that's a long-standing concern, and one which the new Director General of the WTO has sought to address. And I think many of us wish her well. I think in terms of where civil society and organizations such as CUTS and individuals such as myself can contribute is in two ways, really. First, in coming up with new and constructive ideas which help point to ways in which countries can cooperate on trade again. And here the form of cooperation might change. Indeed, the very fact that we're talking about cooperation rather than rulemaking is a subtle but significant shift in the conversation away from the way of doing business that we saw in the 1990s and beyond. Then the second way in which I think civil society can contribute is in fostering dialogue between different experts and different officials in different countries as well. It's unfortunately the case that despite all the meetings in Geneva that take place between diplomats, not much listening goes on. Lots of talking goes on, but not much listening. And I think one contribution of civil society is to help fill that gap and to provide a safe space where ideas can be developed without countries feeling like they're under pressure to make a formal statement. One way in which civil society shouldn't behave, I think, is the following. We shouldn't see ourselves as spokespeople for our governments. And I think the importance of being to be a credible civil society player on the international stage, one must be seen to have some independence. And so we have to walk a fine line between being seen as sort of expert, credible, and independent, and yet at the same time engaging with governments. And that's a difficult line to pull off. I do see from time to time civil society groups defending their own government's positions as if they're spokespeople for their governments. And I think our governments are expert enough at defending themselves. We should get along. We should be thinking much more, several steps ahead about how to revive multilateralism.
Thank you, Simon. I think conversation itself is very important, at least to start with making policies and to move towards building something in future. And as you've rightly pointed out, organizations and civil societies can at least help build the conversation first, and then help in making the policies, and then move towards, building an economy which is resilient and inclusive. Thank you so much, Simon. That was very fascinating, and thank you so much for your valuable time.